When we read the gospel stories of Jesus and his disciples, we have to come to the conclusion that at least some of the disciples, if not all of them, were really expecting Jesus to be the king, an earthly king. You know, to get rid of wicked King Herod, that collaborator with the Romans, to drive out the hated Roman oppressors, and to establish God's kingdom on earth. They also expected, especially James and John, that they were going to get some goodies when Jesus inherited his kingdom. They were going to get to sit on his right and left hand. They were going to get positions of power. You might say they would be appointed to his cabinet in the new administration of Jesus' kingdom, right? That's what they were thinking. That's what they were expecting. It seems likely also that Jesus' opponents felt the same way. When Jesus was called before Herod and Pilate, they could not figure Jesus out. They were used to, especially the Romans, were always used to having these upstart revolutionaries come along, and the Romans knew exactly what to do with them. They would just, crucify them. That was their wonderful, tried and true method. But Jesus, when he's being interviewed by Pilate, does not give the expected answers. Pilate is trying to figure this out. You are the king of the Jews, are you not? And Jesus goes, who told you that? Pilate scratches his head. Well, if you're not the king of the, what are you then? Your own people handed you over. And Jesus says, no. That's what they said. What do you say? And Pilate's still scratching his head. Who is this guy? Jesus says, my kingdom is not from this world. Pilate's like, what? Not from this? What world are you talking about? Mars? If my kingdom were from this world, yes, I would be gathering an army. I would be doing the usual things that a revolutionary does. But my kingdom doesn't work like that. In my kingdom, there are no armies, there's no taxes, there's no laws. In my kingdom, it's a whole different ballgame. And Pilate is now completely confused. But he says, okay, my kingdom, so you are a king then. And Jesus, you can imagine him sighing and shaking his head. You still don't get it. I am here to testify to the truth about God's eternal and glorious and spiritual kingdom. And all Pilate can say in response, his famous question, what is truth? What is truth? I think we, like Jesus' disciples, and in a way like Herod and Pilate, are still struggling all these years later to figure out what it means to call Christ the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Today we're celebrating at the end of our church year the feast of Christ the King. Now, many of our church holidays go way back to the early church, right? Transfiguration and Ascension and Easter and all the church year celebrations are very ancient, but not this one. This one was established in 1925 by Pope Pius XI. In 1925, Pope Pius looked at the world. Remember, this was just after World War I, which was supposed to be the war to end all wars, supposed to usher in a time of global peace. But by 1925, what Pius XI saw was a world that was looking very dark. The rise of totalitarian regimes, the Soviet Union in Russia, fascism in Spain and Italy and Germany, dark clouds on the horizon, the rumblings of more wars. The Spanish Civil War leading into eventually, of course, we know, World War II. And so Pius XI, and then quickly joined by other churches like the Anglican Church, the Orthodox churches, many Protestant churches, said, in the midst of this global darkness, we need to go back to our core values as Christians. We need to proclaim the truth that Christ is the King above every ruler or principality or power. We need to proclaim the good news that our God is the Lord of heaven and earth, and that we should not replace God with any earthly leader or ruler. I think that is still a really important insight for us to hold on to. Christ the King sounds so archaic. We don't have kings anymore, right? We're a Republican democracy. We don't have kings. But this idea of Christ the King, putting Christ ahead and above everything, is super important, because we look at our world today and we see some of the same rumblings and clouds on the horizon. We had Nazis marching in Columbus, Ohio a couple of years ago. Nazis protesting outside of a theater in Michigan. This is not something that belongs to an earlier generation. It's here and now. We have, the rumblings of war. We worry, at least I do when I look at the news, about escalations of war in Ukraine, with North Korean soldiers being sent now to aid the Russian army. Worries about us now arming Ukraine with new types of weapons. Where does that lead? What is that going to look like? Tension between Israel and Iran, which could escalate into another type of regional war in the Middle East. We worry about some of the same pressures and some of the same issues that faced the world 100 years ago. History doesn't repeat itself, it's often said, but it rhymes. And so we worry about those same issues. And in the midst of that, we as Christians try to navigate our way. We try to proclaim what it means to follow Jesus, who is the Prince of Peace. Jesus, whose kingdom has no armies or taxes, but yet persists through all forms of government. It's fascinating to think about how the Christian church has endured in every type of political arrangement: monarchy, dictatorship, oppressive regimes, democracies, all types of arrangements of human governments. The church continues to strive to live by its core principles. And what are those principles? For me, we renewed them a couple weeks ago when we had a baptism. The baptismal covenant reminds us of what it means to follow Jesus Christ, our King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And it means that no matter what policies our government enacts, we as Christians can support or challenge them based on who we are and our core values. To strive, as our baptismal covenant says, for justice and peace among all people. Justice and peace among all people, regardless of their status, their circumstance, their legal status. We still want to make sure that we are doing our part to speak up for the poor, the outcasts, and those who are most vulnerable, and to respect the dignity of every human being, without regard to, again, their status, where they come from, what's going on. It doesn't mean that we necessarily follow one party or another. I was saying at 8 o'clock, when I look at our policy about immigration, right, we've had different policies. We're going to welcome everybody. We're going to keep some out. We're not, now we're talking about deportations. That's a decision that the government makes. But in the midst of that, we can still strive to respect the dignity of every human being. And when I look at political parties, I can't say that one party has been pristine on this issue, right? We are bipartisan sinners. We have to admit that whatever the political party, we have not always adhered to those core principles. We have often treated others without respect and without regard to justice. So I invite us, as we celebrate Christ the King, to meditate a little bit ourselves on what that looks like for us. How are we going to acknowledge and renew our identity as God's people in the midst of a very divided country and a very threatening world? How will we be a light in the darkness? How will we strive to help those who are the most vulnerable and speak up for those who have no voice and care for those who are hurting in a variety of ways? We do that in so many ways as a church community, through our outreach, through our acts of generosity and kindness to one another and to the world. And I think in a way, one of the ways we can practice that as a church community is within the bound. I mean, we always talk about you got to go out and do it in the world, but partly it's also how do we strive to love one another even in this diverse community of people? How do we respect the dignity of all of our family? How do we strive for justice and peace as a community here and now? What does that look like? And how might we grow together in loving service to our God, who deigned to become one of us in Jesus Christ, to put aside all the trappings of power? If you think about it, Christ was, as the Son of God, able to call legions of angels, could have raised an army with a snap of his fingers, and yet chose to put aside all earthly power, to become incredibly vulnerable, even to the point of being arrested and crucified as a common criminal. In his act of humble service, we find what it truly means to follow Jesus as our King of Kings and Lord of Lords. May we practice that same kind of self-giving, self-humbling, and self-sacrificing love as we strive to be God's people. Amen.